We can't tell you how frustrating it was for us to upload our podcast when we first got started. The websites were clunky, we had data limits, and it was all so confusing. That is, until we found Zencastr. Zencastr is an online platform built for podcasters to not only upload their podcasts, track their listeners, connect their audience, and so much more. Zencastr plans have no upload or download limits, so your cost won't grow as you do. Embed their player that automatically updates to show the latest episode of your show. Zencastr lets you see your podcast downloads along with your traffic, website, and Google Analytics. Zencastr also supports multiple podcasts under one account. The best part is, if you already have a podcast on another platform, you can switch to Zencastr with a one-click importer, all free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/Zencastr to start saving time and money with your podcast today. Welcome to this week's episode of How to Make a Podcast. My name is Nick Miller, and I am so excited because for the second week in a row, I am joined by my good friend, Mr. Blake Pollino, answering your questions. But first, Blake, how are you doing today? What's good in your world?
I am great. The weather's finally getting a little chilly down here in Texas. So we'll have that for, who knows, a couple weeks. Then we'll get a random day in the 80s or 90s.
By chilly, what do you mean? Because I think your chili in South Texas is different than my chili in Wichita, Kansas.
So it was 40, and that was pretty cold. That gets pretty cold for us. We get snow every once in a while. Once every couple of years, it'll snow on us, and everybody freaks out. Like, it's panic mode. Like, clean the grocery stores out. Like, if you're old, you may not survive. Like, it's the whole thing.
Two stories real quick. One, my friend Cliff from high school moved to Austin, Texas. And we grew up in Kansas City where, it didn't snow all the time, but we got a good amount of snow. And so, people knew how to drive on the snow, like in that area. He moved to Austin and he said it snowed and they canceled school for 3 days.
Pandemonium.
3 days. And he said on day one, he walked outside and there was a dusting and you could only see the snow like on the curbs.
Yeah.
And that was it. And for 3 days, school was canceled in Austin, Texas.
We lose our minds. Like, in our defense, we have no infrastructure. Like, we have no salt trucks. Like, we have no, and no one knows how to drive in it, right? So, and we have a ton of overpasses. I don't know what it is about Texas and overpasses. We love a good overpass, and those things freeze like crazy.
Everything's
the snow,
bigger in Texas, and so they just
including
want to
our
have
overpasses.
These. Like in Dallas,
for no reason.
In Dallas, it's almost like you're driving on a roller coaster. Like they're so high up in the. Anyways,
just for fun.
Another thing that COVID has ruined. Okay, so we do our schools. Our kids are in school. They're in elementary. We started a month late. Wednesdays are remote learning, so they go to school, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, home on Wednesday. We had a snow day on Monday because it iced and was cold here. But guess what? There are no snow days built into the schedule because they started a month late. So we had to do 2 remote learning days at home.
Poor kids.
And so COVID ruined snow days.
Way to go, COVID.
On top of everything else, it's ruined.
Thanks, 2020.
So if you missed last week's episode, Blake did a great job of explaining who he is. Like most people, when you say talk about yourself, they do a good job doing that. But Blake just shared he's a wedding filmmaker just like myself and John. That's kind of how we met. That is how we met. And, he has ventured into a whole bunch of different things. And one of the things that he has fallen into is he's a podcast producer and also hoster and editor. So kind of the whole gamut of podcasting Blake is now involved with. He is our editor. We call him Blake the Editor. He edits both How to Film Weddings and How to Make a Podcast. And so that is, in a nutshell, who Blake is. And I took the honor of telling everyone who you are instead of letting you do that for this week.
It's like a biography. I feel super honored now.
There we go. There, like those episodes, those podcasts, the radio shows where the host builds you up and talks about you while you're on
gives you the resume and you have to listen to it. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
So, again, in our Facebook group a couple of weeks ago, I just asked, does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have anything that you would like for us to cover, for us to talk about? And I was going to do this episode solo, and I was like, you know what? Why don't I have Blake? Why don't I see if Blake wants to come on and answer some questions with me? So that's what we are doing today. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right in and answer some more of your questions that you asked from our group. And we're going to start with Marcus's question, and he asked this. Any ideas on executing a co-host search, getting the word out, and the audition process? So just kind of wondering, hey, I would like a co-host. How do I find one?
Love this. I love this question. And I think you should definitely talk about it, because I think I've said this on multiple times with you and John. The stars aligned, I think, perfectly with the two of you in the way that you work as co-hosts. The chemistry that you guys have together works great. And I think a lot of people, and I think the reason for this question, go through a difficult process in trying to find that. And I think a lot of it is definitely a trial and error thing. I definitely think we got really lucky in NFL weddings that your personalities just really mesh and they don't conflict, but because I think that's definitely easy to do in the podcast world. But yeah, tell us about the NFL weddings kind of experience.
Yeah, so how our story is, John and I met, we filmed a wedding together. We decided we wanted to get into educational content. We started YouTube videos. We made a few, nothing that really took off or anything like that. But then our wedding seasons hit. So we quit making YouTube videos, and then we came back together in October of 2018, and we recorded something that we wanted to put on our YouTube channel that ended up being kind of like a podcast. So we're like, hey, I think we just recorded a podcast, and it kind of went from there. So one thing, if you are looking for a co-host, do you already have an established podcast? Who is going to be doing the work? These are all kind of things, is this your podcast and someone else is coming on? Because if it's your baby, no one else is going to care for your baby like you do. So if you have a podcast and you want to bring someone else on, and then after a couple of months, they're like, okay, I'm done with this, then you're kind of left with no podcast host. And then the searches, going out there again, so find someone. Do you know people in real life right now that you would like to talk to about this? Is there anyone that you can kind of hit up and exchange ideas with and kind of float it out there? That might be where I would start, rather than just a random internet Craigslist posting, hey, looking for podcast host. Start with people that I think that, so one of the things that I see a lot in a couple of Facebook groups I'm in, is people just saying, hey, anyone want to co-host a podcast with me?
Yes.
And it's just very, very open.
Terrifying.
It is, because you don't know anything about the person. Right. What if you are you want to have a very business financial podcast, and you do an open-ended, hey, who wants to be on here? And someone that really loves movies and cinema, and that's their niche, and they're like, yeah, I'll do this with you, but you want to talk about finance and they want to talk about movies. Okay, those two things aren't going to go together very well. Okay, so finding someone that is proficient how you are proficient, or proficient in the same field but maybe in different ways. John and I are a really good example of this. John is so good, such a good business mind. He is so good at forward thinking. He is so good at reaching out to sponsors, and everything that he does, he's thinking about, okay, how is this going to benefit us or affect us in 2, 3, 6, 12 months from now? Whenever we started doing this YouTube and podcast stuff, he said, we might not make a dime for 24 months. Are you okay with that? Are you committed to doing this? And so we kind of set that up early. So he's really good at that. And then what I bring to the table, I am way more, the design, how it looks, how it feels, how it sounds. That stuff is way more my strength. And so we are able to come together, and we both have, combined, we have 20 years in the wedding video community. So we are able to share our expertise, but then John's strengths shine, my strengths shine, and we're able to work together. So just going out randomly and hiring someone and finding someone, I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying to me. I've seen those same posts where somebody will be like, "Hey, I'm making such and such podcast. Does anybody want to be a co-host?" And I'm like, "Oh, just like some random stranger." And I guess it could be an interesting discovery process, but so much of it is finding these complementing personalities, right? So obviously, whatever niche that you're in, like whatever category within podcasting you're in, you want somebody who's involved in that, whether it's that type of business they're in or activity that they're in or interest that they're in. But having differing compatibilities is what I think makes work great with you and John, because you're both in the same industry. We'll use How to Film Weddings as an example. You're both wedding filmmakers, but you were both also in very different places in your business at the time when you first started. So that gave people a very different perspective, right? So you were able to both speak from the same place, but from a very different perspective within the same little niche. But John would talk about, you guys were charging, there's a pretty big gap in what you were charging when you first met. And so I remember when I first started listening to your podcast, just as a listener, I would relate a lot to where you were in that. And then it gives people a lot of relatability to have that. You don't want to be too wildly different, or maybe you do. Maybe you want that little bit of conflict and debate or whatever it is. But I think those are really good tips, and definitely start with probably someone that you know. And I think it would be really difficult to start a podcast with a stranger, but to each their own.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you are going to go, an audition kind of process or, that kind of thought for a co-host, somewhere you could start is, do you have a podcast? Have you run one? Do you have something? Can I listen to it? Those kind of things I think would be really beneficial for you. But unless you just happen to get really lucky, starting something with someone that you have spent no time with, that you don't really know, it's going to be a lot harder of a move, in my opinion. So,
for sure.
Okay.
So I want to ask you the next question here. This one is from Michelle Miller, no relation, I would assume.
Not that I know of.
Not that you know of. There's a lot of Millers out there. How do you make reasonable goals for your podcast? Everyone has different strategies, and I'm trying to authentically grow my podcast without a high budget, especially since I'm still confused about Facebook ads. How do you set reasonable goals for your podcast?
Okay. The biggest thing that I want you to start with is being self-aware.
Sure.
That is really, really hard for a lot of us out there, is we think that we are the exception to the rule, and most of us are not the exception to the rule.
Right.
And we know that it's hard to build a following. It's hard to build an audience. It's hard to get those numbers and get the sponsors. And John and I know that we are kind of the outliers in, getting the amount of downloads and how fast we grow. Like we understand that. So setting reasonable goals. I mean, when it comes to download numbers, okay, let's say, Michelle, you've been doing this you've been doing it for 4 months, and you only have, you have a few hundred downloads. Let's say you have 500 downloads in 4 months. An unreasonable goal is saying, okay, next month I'm going to get 10,000 downloads. Like, you're not being self-aware in that, right? So again, and I mentioned this in the last episode, comparing yourself against yourself. And it's totally okay to have monthly goal updates or something like that. So you can kind of say, okay, this is where I want to be. If in October I had 300 downloads, maybe for November, I say, okay, this month I want to go for 350 and kind of go from there. Another thing that John and I have done for quite a while is we take all of the numbers that we have and we write them down each month. So we're going to be like YouTube subscribers, downloads this month, Instagram followers, Facebook group, all these numbers. And then we're just kind of having a running total of how many we have at the beginning of each month. So if you're not writing stuff down, it can be really hard to gauge to gauge those metrics, right? So now I can see, oh, this month we have 5,500 YouTube subscribers on How to Film Weddings, and last month we only had 500, okay, or 5,000. So we've gained 500 in the last month. Like, kind of seeing that kind of stuff can be very beneficial. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I like that she said reasonable goals, and I think that's one of the first parts about this is to look at the demographic and the niche that your podcast or the category that your podcast is in, and be realistic about those goals. So, to give you an example, one of the podcasts that we produce and that I co-host is a local regional podcast that we make with a chamber of commerce. That's never going to be number one on the podcast charts. Like, it's never going to have 1 million downloads. It's never going to have 100,000 downloads. But we know exactly where we are. We know exactly what lane we're in, and it's already got sponsors. It had sponsors from episode number 1 because we were able to identify that. So it really is looking at where you want that podcast to be, and kind of what place you want that to fill. Obviously, and we've had some questions about this, is it better to be super niche or is it better to be really, really broad? And what we found from, all of the podcasts that we produce, from How to Film Weddings, from How to Make a Podcast, the more narrow you can get with these, it's crazy what people are out there looking for. Like, we know of a guy, my co-host on the Chamber of Commerce podcast, her husband listens to a podcast about dirt. Like some type of engineering podcast. Like it's incredible what type of podcasts are out there. So we're in the process of producing another podcast that we'll be working on, where when we went out and did kind of our research and our development on it, there were only 2 podcasts in this category. One of them had started and kind of fizzled out. The other was still going strong, but the more narrow you can take it, that's going to give you an idea of what those goals are, right? And look at what that category is. So for us, we're looking at competing podcasts. I mean, competing is a hard word to use because it's a lot of people will subscribe to multiple podcasts. You don't have to just subscribe to one. So look at what is happening in your category. If there are people who are doing really well, the crazy thing about podcasts is you can't really tell how well another podcast is doing just by looking at it. They may have 100 episodes and 20 downloads an episode, or not to say those numbers are terrible, but you may in your mind think that this is this huge podcast that has all of these downloads, and they may not for that matter. So look at your category, kind of look at the niche that you're in, and that kind of helps you be reasonable with those goals, I think.
Yeah. And then she said, I'm trying to authentically grow my podcast without a high budget, especially since I'm still confused with Facebook ads. So, everyone has different strategies. So you're just going to have to figure out, what's the best for you. One thing that if you don't want to pay, if you can, John and I highly recommend, creating a Facebook group and kind of having that be your hub for your podcast. A product that we do offer is our podcast magnet, which our friend Carrie Egler, who has ran a couple of successful course launches for us, breaks down exactly how to use Facebook ads. So you can pick that up over at howtomakeapodcast.co/shop. So Michelle, great question. We hope that this information was helpful for you. Blake, we have more questions that we are going to answer, and we will get to them right after this break.
If you have a pulse, you probably hate the subject of taxes and running the bookkeeping portion of your business. But like it or not, if you want to be a successful podcaster, you are going to have to pay attention to your numbers. But don't worry, we have the answer for you, Core Financial. Our friends over at Core Financial have taken the pressure off of us so we can focus on what we love doing most, running our podcast. They take care of all of our taxes, monthly bookkeeping, financial plans, and make sure we take full advantage of all of the tax benefits we qualify for. It just feels good knowing we aren't going to get a big surprise during tax season. If you are serious about building a business with your podcast, head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/core to see what they can do for you.
So you've got everything you need for your podcast. You've recorded your audio and video. You're so excited, but wait, you don't know how to master the audio or edit the video of your podcast. We know someone who can help. the podcast editors. Picture this. You record both audio and video for your podcast. You upload it to your remote editor, and a few days later, your podcast is ready for you to upload and push to the world. What will you do with your extra time? Connect with sponsors? Grow your Facebook group? Start that project or even course you have dreamed of for months? The possibilities are endless. We are blown away by the podcast editors and love working with them and using their services. They can edit audio, video, or both for your podcast. Don't get stuck trying to do this on your own. Get in touch with the podcast editors today. If you'd like to save 50% off of your first project, head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/thepodcasteditors. Welcome back from break. I am here with my friend Blake Pollino, and we are answering your questions that you submitted in our Facebook group. So now we're going to do our question of the day presented by the Podcast Magnet. Yes, I just mentioned it, but if you head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/shop, you can pick up this wonderful tool that will help you learn all about Facebook ads. That's the Podcast Magnet. So, Blake, our question of the day presented by the Podcast Magnet is, how many downloads looks impressive enough from a sponsor?
So
Did I lose you? Are you there?
Okay. Yeah. So it could be zero. So we've talked about this in the last episode, and I won't go super deep into it. If you haven't listened to it, go back to the last episode and listen. But podcast that I produce and co-host, we had sponsors from day one, because we approached a company that already had an audience, they already had a following, and there were already sponsors to do that. So that being said, that means the answer to this question is it varies wildly. One of the things that Nick and John teach, and I think John stole this from somebody, but the riches are in the niches, right? So it's if you find a category where that need is, there are sponsors who are looking for that captive audience. And if you can build that captive audience, it really doesn't matter. If I'm a business owner and I have a product or I have a service or I have a business I want to advertise, and you have exactly what that market is, and I alluded to this in the last podcast, fantastic book that I just finished called This is Marketing by Seth Godin, talks about finding that captive audience, knowing where they are. And a lot of times, podcast, that's where your audience is. That's where your audience is listening. And statistics show that people who are listening to this podcast, if they trust you and they trust what you're talking about based on your content, they're willing to buy products that you recommend. So if you've built that, it doesn't. There's not a set number. And we've sold sponsorships for podcasts that we produce. We've helped them, negotiate sponsorships, reached out to sponsors on their behalf. And not once have we ever had a sponsor come back and say, hey, you've got to have this number. Now, sure, there are some major podcast sponsors that sponsor tons, like ZipRecruiter. Yeah, ZipRecruiter's going to give you a number and says, hey, you've got to have X number of downloads or we're not even going to talk to you, or an X number of subscribers, we're not even going to talk to you. But if you're focusing not broad like that and you're not going after ZipRecruiter or MeUndies or what a Squarespace, the other really, really popular podcast sponsors, if you're really focusing within your niche, it's easy to reach out to these sponsors and say, hey, we have the audience that is captivated and it would be interested in your product. So that's kind of our take on it.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to say is it's going to be a lot harder for you to get a sponsor if you do not have relationships and you not some big name whatever, The Office ladies, Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey, that's her last name, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't it? Okay. When they started
technically.
Whenever they started the Office Ladies podcast, they had sponsors because they were on one of the most popular American comedies in the last, 30 years so it was really easy for them to say, hey, because they knew that millions and millions of people are going to tune in on episode 1. Okay. Yep. So you just need to be kind of mindful about that. John and I, with How to Film Weddings, we didn't get an official sponsor until episode 30 something of our podcast. But with How to Make a Podcast, before we even launched episode 1, we had 3 sponsors lined up based on the relationships that we had already built with How to Film Weddings. So, who you know and who you are does matter. If you don't have a name, if you don't have a following and you would like some sort of sponsorship, we highly recommend maybe some sort of affiliate marketing for you to kind of push at the very beginning if you want to try to make a little bit of money. So hope that answers your question there. Estelle asked this one: is it necessary to have super high niche podcast versus a more broad approach like Tony Robbins? Our recommendation is that you need to have some sort of niche, and you need to always be funneling everything that you do into that niche. If you don't, you are going to lose your way very, very easily. Tony Robbins might cover a bunch of different topics, but he still has his niche of, self-improvement, business minded, like all of that kind of stuff. So he still has that. But if you want to make money from this, it's way easier to do that whenever you have a specific niche and you have a specific audience.
So next one, we're going to kind of rapid fire some of these just so we can cover some information.
Let's do it.
We may not, be a long answer, but this one is from Josh Weldon. I see a lot of guidelines telling you what size your artwork needs to be, but I can't find anything that shows you how to actually make it, so it adheres to those specifications. I'd love some direction on how or info to do that. So definitely dive into some YouTube on this. I would venture to say that there's definitely a YouTube tutorial on how to make a podcast thumbnail, but the short answer of it is between 1500 by 1500 and 3000 by 3000 is kind of the standard size for that. So when you create a Photoshop file, when you first open it up, it gives you the option to create the dimensions. I reckon we always do ours at 3000 by 3000 just because you're starting at a higher res image. Anywhere that image goes, you're ensuring that it's going to have the best quality. So.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So 3000, but it's a square, a big square created in there. Matthew Reed asks, how do you ensure that the guests on your podcast won't be boring? I don't know if you can ensure that your guest won't be boring.
That's a tough one. Definitely research them before. I mean, you want somebody that has an interesting story, at least, that can be captivating. The other thing is we talked about in the last episode is sending a questionnaire back and forth for them, so you get that info. Sending them, asking for questions from them that they'd like to be asked. That can make everybody's got a story, man. Pretty interesting.
This is also a plug for maybe recording at least one or two episodes ahead if you can. That way you have one in the bag ready to go. If you just have a guest that is really boring or it just doesn't go well or something like that, you're not going to mess up your production timeline. You're not going to mess up when you like to release because you don't have anything. So that might be a good thing for you to do.
Next quick one here. What is the optimal podcast episode length? There isn't one.
There is not one. No, there are. Isn't there a guy that has something like the Marketing Minute, and every day he releases like a 5-minute. Just
crazy. There's crazy quick ones. There's super long ones, like a one that I'm a big fan of. The Tim Ferriss Show, the author of the 4-Hour Workweek. It's not uncommon. He'll do like a 3-hour podcast, and I'll listen to every minute of it. Like, there's those Dak Shepard, Armchair Expert. Like, that's a crazy long podcast too that you can listen to. But yeah, like some of the early news ones, like Up First NPR. That's like a 15-minute morning podcast. So there's not. So whatever fits with the content that you want. Obviously, if you don't have enough content, don't make an hour-long podcast, right? So don't drag it out, but don't rush it either.
And in saying all of that, the content is still king. So
100%.
If your content is bad, people would rather listen to an hour-long podcast if it's great content than a 5-minute podcast where it's terrible content. Okay,
100%.
People are going to go where the content is. So whatever. John and I, for this one, we have found that we were trying to do about 30-minute episodes for how to make a podcast. For how to film weddings, we were trying to do about an hour. Now we're trying to scale that back just a little bit to about 45 minutes. But that's kind of where we want to be. Noble Gibbons asked this: what questions are important to ask yourself in helping dial in your audience? So in helping, you need to let your audience know exactly what it is that you are talking about. And whenever it comes to figuring that out and figuring out your niche, 3 questions you need to ask yourself. What are you passionate about? What's that thing that really, just gets you really excited? And that's the thing that you want to talk about. Okay. What are you proficient about? This is kind of where these two meet the road. Okay. I have met so many people in life that are, something like an accountant or even they have a high paying job, something that all of us would see as successful. They are very proficient at it, but they hate it. And they are doing it because of the paycheck. They are doing it because that's what they know what to do, but they do not like it. Okay. So you have to ask yourself, am I proficient in this? And am I passionate about this? Where do those 2 things meet? That is going to be a great start for figuring out your niche and figuring out who your audience is. The last question that we like to ask, because we like this money component of potentially sponsoring your podcast, is it profitable? Is it profitable? And so it could be something that you're very passionate about, that you're very proficient in, but thinking about that profitability might make you kind of think about it and think, maybe this isn't the podcast, this isn't the direction I want to go because I don't know a way how to make money. But definitely the passion and proficient part, if you can answer those and then name your podcast something that tells your listener what you are listening to without them really doing much digging, how to make a podcast. That's pretty self-explanatory for a title of a podcast. So doing that, I think, will really help you figure out who your audience is.
Very straightforward. All right, so last little quick one that we'll do, or maybe we'll do another if we have time. Totally up to you. What is the optimal frequency of posting podcast episodes? I'll kind of get my 2 cents on it real quick. We always, and we talk about this a lot in the course, but we're always beginning with the end in mind when it comes to this. So we're thinking about who that target consumer is, like who that target listener is. When do they want to listen to this podcast? How often are they going to want to listen to that? Because of that, it affects how often we post the podcast, what time of day we post the podcast. Like I'm a big proponent of people like to start their day with them, on their commute. So we want them to be there and ready for them in the morning when they wake up. But it comes down to how much content you're comfortable producing. Mm-hmm. So like on the production side, having produced podcasts and edited them, it's a lot of work to make a podcast. Like I was looking at it and it was blowing my mind at how many hours of podcast content we're producing every week. But if you want to put out an hour podcast once a week, you're going to put an exponential number more hours of work into making that podcast. So first off, your content, like you've got to have enough content to do that. Like we talked about in the last question. Don't put out a podcast every week if you don't have the content to support that. But kind of once a week is basically the industry standard. But there are a lot of people who do bi-weekly. There are people who do once every month. But if you really want something to do well, especially with the algorithms and everything else we have in the world, being there as much as possible is definitely a big benefit. Yeah.
The answer that I was going to say is consistently.
Yep.
So kind of however often you want to do it, just make sure that you do it on that day when you say you are going to. So if you're going to do it once a month, say we're the first Monday of every month, okay, then you make sure that you do that. That's what I would say. Obviously, like Blake is saying, the more that you do it, the better it's going to be and more likely that people are going to catch on to it. I'm sure that people that only do monthly podcasts, unless it's something that's like highly produced and like a story, kind of with a bunch of different voices and, it's more like a television show, something like that. Like I could see some success in them doing it monthly, but a normal, just 2 people talking back and forth, doing it once a month. I don't think that that's enough if you want to really get that traction. But again, the consistent component, I think matters a ton.
Yeah. And if you're making good content, people are looking forward to that. And that's at every level of podcasting. You don't feel like you have to be making this just like absolute banger of a podcast for people to be looking forward to your work. I mean, there are podcasts that I'm like anxiously waiting for every day that, that it drops, whatever day that is. I'm scrolling, like refreshing, waiting for it. So having that's a big help to your audience.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question, and I think that I get this one kind of a lot, and I think there's some confusion out there. So Tracy asked, "What is the best way to push out a podcast? I heard about people using different platforms, but I'm interested in knowing the options that push out to the most platforms that are also cost effective and allow you to own your own material." So, there are two things that you need to be made aware of when you have a podcast. You have your host, which is something like Zencast, which we use for this one, Libsyn, Podbean, Anchor. There's probably hundreds of them out there. There are a lot of them out there. Okay. So those are your host. Okay. I'm assuming that most of them, are going to be platforms when you upload it, you do still own the content. Now, they might be able to do whatever they want with it. Like that could be their terms of service, but it will still be yours, like legally, because you are the one that made it, and that copyright laws are pretty clear on that. If I'm the one that makes it, right? So, but then whenever it comes to the platform, those are going to be things like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, like all. Amazon just launched a pod catcher. So there are all these different platforms. So you're just going to need to do some research. They all really do the same thing when it comes to pushing it out to the platforms. I have never heard of a podcast host that could limit the number of places where your podcast goes. Okay. So if you're paying, what you're going to be paying for more is going to be like the analytics and the data that you will receive on like number of downloads and countries and like that sort of information. That's what you're going to pay more for on the specific host. But you are able to put that wherever you want it to. Our recommendation when it comes to platforms is to get your podcast on all of them, because you want to go where people are. I've heard of some people that are like, oh, I only want to do it on Spotify. Is Spotify the one that owns Anchor? I think they are. And so I think that, if you're using their free platform, it only goes to Spotify because of that. And so, but like a person like me is never going to listen to your podcast if you're doing that, because I don't have a subscription to Spotify. So like, I'm not going to do it. And then, there's other people that are only uploading to Apple Podcasts, but iPhones only make up like half of the phones in the world. So you're missing out on an entire half of the world audience because you are only listening to that platform. So you want to get your podcast on as many platforms as possible. Yeah,
totally agree. I mean, some of them make it a little bit easier to aggregate, especially when you set up. So one of the reasons we like Zencast so much is it makes that initial setup a lot easier to getting it across all of the platforms. With some of the different delivery aggregators, you have to individually go to each of these and set them up individually, and then you like copy and paste your stuff. So that's one of the reasons we like it so much, is it's all kind of built in and set up, and it's all kind of in one place. But yeah, as many places as you can possibly get it. I mean, if you can get it on there and not have to pay for it or anything like that, definitely do it.
Yeah. So, man, lots of good questions. Thanks everyone for submitting some of those. Blake, it has been a pleasure. It has been fun to hang out with you today, answering some of these questions. Do you have anything that you want to add? I don't know, putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, no, as always, great to hang out with you. Great to talk with you. Great to see your face. I think I made that joke on the How to Film Weddings podcast when I was on it. It's like, it's still good to see your face, even though I've probably seen you and John's face more than anybody else. I've edited literally hundreds of hours of your faces, but it's still great. Literally. It's still great to see you guys. Still great to talk with you, and we miss John, and he'll be back. But it was great to fill in a little bit and get to chat some podcasts, man. I love some podcasts.
Yeah, for sure. So if you are listening at home, we want you to head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/shop. There, I'm going to plug it again because it's the one thing I can think about. You can pick up our podcast magnet there. It is a full breakdown, about an hour-long tutorial, 45 minutes or so, on how to use Facebook ads for your podcast so that you can reach the right kind of people and help them discover your podcast, and you can really get them into your ecosystem. So that is the podcast magnet. Blake, again, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all for listening. And until next time, we will see ya.
See ya.